Early in the morning, my front door shook violently. My daughter-in-law screamed my name as if the house belonged to her. I had changed every lock the night before. A few minutes later, my son arrived holding a sledgehammer. He yelled, "I'm coming in whether you let me or not." Just as his arm lifted to strike, a voice came from behind me. "Let me handle it." The heavy oak door swung wide, and the sight of who stood beside me instantly drained the frantic colour from their greedy faces. Have you ever felt like a stranger or an outsider in your own family? Drop a comment below, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Let's see who is standing strong in our community today. To understand why an old woman had to secure her own fortress against her own blood, you have to look at the wreckage of the past 90 days. 3 months ago, I wasn't this cold. I was just a mother who believed love could absorb any disaster. Matthew and Stephanie arrived at 516 Magnolia Lane with their 2 children, Megan and Caleb, carrying overstuffed suitcases and weeping about a banking foreclosure. They claimed they had nowhere else to turn, that they were completely repossessed and destitute. My house in Charleston, South Carolina was a spacious sanctuary, far too silent since my late husband David passed away. I opened the doors out of a primal instinct to protect them, handing over an initial $6,000 in cash to absorb their immediate moving debts. I welcomed the noise, the small footsteps, the warmth of a full kitchen. I didn't see the trap. I didn't see that Stephanie's expensive designer perfume was an anomaly for someone who had just lost her livelihood. The invasion began subtly under the deceptive banner of modernization. Stephanie began a systematic purge of my history. It started with the hand-embroidered white linens my own mother had spent months sewing. Stephanie packed them into damp cardboard boxes and shoved them into the crawl space, claiming they made the bedrooms look dated and old-fashioned. Next came David's favourite leather wingback chair, the one where he sat every evening to read poetry. She dragged it to the dark corners of the garage without my permission, stating the floor plan needed to look roomier and more elegant. I watched my son Matthew stand by and nod in total compliance with his wife's parasitic rearrangement of my boundaries. Whenever I attempted to speak up, my son would chuckle dismissively and tell me not to cling to dead things, that Stephanie had immaculate taste and I should trust her. I became a shadow in my own home, a tolerated tenant in a space I had spent 42 years building. The financial asymmetry was staggering, though they treated my assets like a communal subscription. When the house required structural reinforcement against the shifting South Carolina soil, they boasted to the neighbours about taking care of the property. But the bank receipts on my laptop tell the cold, absolute truth. I alone funded $17,400 for the structural underpinning from my personal account. When the central air failed, I paid $10,400 for a new energy-efficient HVAC system. My compassion was treated as a domestic obligation, a luxury they continuously overdrafted without a single word of gratitude. The breaking point arrived when the theft crossed from my walls to my skin. I didn't cry, I didn't ask why. I went to my mahogany vanity, looking for my heirloom silver jewelry set. It was a generational family treasure, hand-cast and officially appraised at $9,000. The velvet box was empty. When I confronted Stephanie in the dark, grey-painted living room, she didn't even blink. She casually smoothed her clothes and told me she had liquidated the silver at a pawn shop for a mere $1,600 to cover their immediate expenses. She looked at me with a smug, chilling smile and said I should be grateful they were keeping me company so I wouldn't die alone. I stood there, feeling the tactile void of those empty drawers, realising my son's family hadn't come to stay temporarily. They had come to consume me whole. My compassion had been a luxury my son and his wife overdrafted for years, but their next move wasn't just an overdraft, it was a complete liquidation of my remaining maternal sanity. Stephanie began staging a medical emergency. She started waking up late, dragging her feet through the dark grey corridors and leaving half-filled teacups on the counter while gripping her stomach. She drop-fed hints of advanced oncology symptoms, weeping quietly when she knew I was watching from the doorway. She claimed she had no health insurance, that private care was completely out of reach, and that she was stricken with an imminent medical tragedy. Panic blinded my financial judgment. I immediately contacted my financial advisor, liquidated a stable portion of the emergency mutual funds David had left me, and authorized an expedited withdrawal. 2 days later, I walked straight into the kitchen and handed Stephanie an envelope stuffed with $24,000 in cash I had just withdrawn from the bank. I thought I was buying her a future. I thought I was saving a life. In reality, I was funding an asset transformation project. Everything stayed silent for days, but inside my head, a cold clarity was beginning to freeze over. My 72-year-old friend Catherine, whose granddaughter worked as a receptionist at the Charleston Cosmetic Pavilion, called me with factual, undeniable data. Stephanie hadn't spent a single dime on clinical trials. She had used exactly $23,000 of my emergency cash for a luxury facial sculpting, lipo-contouring, and deep abdominal lift package managed by her own brother's medical office. Standing in my grey-painted kitchen, staring at the empty space where my husband's memories used to sit, I analysed the architecture of my own compliance. This house had become a silent prison, and I had been the one holding the keys to my own confinement. I had fallen into the invisible chains of a long-term survival mechanism, a psychological lock where a mother normalizes ongoing disrespect just to keep the illusion of family whole. I was so terrified of an empty, quiet house that I allowed my biological offspring to turn my maternal devotion into an open bank account for their vanity. My affection had been a subscription plan, and they had been happily draining my resources while erasing my existence piece by piece. When Matthew walked into the kitchen later that evening, smelling of cheap takeout, I confronted him with the clinical precision of an accountant. I didn't scream. I didn't lose control. I simply laid out the facts of the cosmetic surgery billing records. My son didn't flinch. He didn't offer a single word of regret or apology. He casually grabbed a pastry from the box, looked at me with flat, uncaring eyes, and shrugged. He said I was overreacting, that I wasn't using that extra capital anyway, and that a fresh appearance made his wife feel happy. He told me that if I was going to create a toxic mess over a bit of lifestyle support, maybe they should just pack up and leave me to rot alone in this massive house. They weren't shocked by the fraud they had committed. They were just shocked that I had stopped playing along. The quiet in the house shifted from peaceful to transactional. I stopped reacting and started observing. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. One humid evening near midnight, as the ceiling fan pushed heavy air across the kitchen, I went downstairs for a glass of water and stopped dead on the wooden staircase. Whispers were bleeding from the dark back porch, Matthew and Stephanie's voices. I pressed myself against the doorframe, wrapped in shadows, and let my phone screen stay black. Stephanie's voice was stripped of its sugary facade, ringing cold and calculating. She said they just needed to break me down for 3 more months. They wanted to manipulate me into signing over the property deed under the excuse of age-related cognitive decline and memory lapses. Once I feared my own mind, they would force me into a cheap, negligent care home outside the city that cost $3,500 a month, paid entirely by draining my own pension. They wanted to clear the title, extract the $850,000 from this estate, and use it as a down payment for a luxury condo by the park in Manhattan. They claimed they deserved a future, and I only possessed the past. Then came Matthew's response, a heavy stone dropping straight into my soul. You're right, Stephanie. Mum's lived here long enough. We deserve this house. Standing in the darkness of my own staircase, the submissive caregiver inside me died completely. I reached into my pocket and switched on the mini voice recorder Catherine had given me, capturing every venomous syllable. As the digital wheels turned, I recognized the exact psychological mechanics of their psychological siege. This was the trap of cruel normalization. To swallow an asset whole, a toxic relative must first systematically diminish your humanity. They turn the parent into an inconvenient burden, an unviable relic of the past, so their financial theft looks like a responsible, logical solution. They don't see themselves as predators. They actively rewire their conscience to believe that your ongoing survival is an unearned inheritance. They are being denied. They minimize your decades of labor until your existence is just an accounting error blocking their lifestyle goals. The tape spun silently, locking their legal liability into a concrete file. I didn't confront them. I didn't make a sound. I went back upstairs with my water glass empty, but my strategy full. 2 days later at dinner, I casually set the bait. I pushed my food around my plate, sighed heavily, and mentioned that maintaining Magnolia Lane was growing far too heavy at my age. I told them I was ready to consider a senior care facility so they could fully take over the property. Stephanie nearly clapped her hands in victory, her eyes lighting up like Christmas lights. Matthew took my hand, telling me how wise I was and how proud he was of my choices. They were completely unaware that the countdown to their eviction had begun. I'd already called Robert Gregory, David's elite legal strategist, instructing him to finalise an irrevocable trust document and arrive at Magnolia Lane on Monday morning. That night, I heard them pop open champagne upstairs, laughing and celebrating their supposed victory. I lay in the dark, smiling a cold mathematical smile. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea they had just walked straight into a sovereign cage. The clock on the wall read precisely 6:07 in the morning when the professional counteroffensive transformed my domestic nightmare into an absolute, unyielding legal war. Robert Gregory had entered through the garden gate before the first sliver of dawn broke over Charleston, carrying an immaculate leather portfolio that held the total destruction of my son's ambition. When the front door commotion finally cleared and it swung open, the heavy atmosphere of intimidation evaporated instantly. Matthew stood frozen on the porch, the heavy construction sledgehammer slipping completely from his fingers and hitting the wooden porch boards with a dull, hollow thud that echoed through the open entryway. Stephanie's mouth hung open like a stranded fish, her carefully applied makeup completely mismatched with the sudden panic bleeding into her eyes, while Megan and Caleb watched, terrified, from the backseat of their idling SUV. They knew exactly who Robert was. They knew that David had trusted him with every single metric of our wealth, and they knew his presence meant their entire plan had just collapsed into ash. Robert didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply unzipped his briefcase, pulled out a thick, certified folder, and looked at them with eyes made of absolute steel. He informed them cleanly that they no longer possessed any residency, visitation, or legal access rights to 516 Magnolia Lane. The property had been securely placed into an irrevocable trust under my sole control, rendering their threats completely unviable. Stephanie immediately attempted to pivot back into her standard manipulation tactic, squeezing out theatrical tears and crying that they were family, that I couldn't let a stranger throw my own grandchildren onto the pavement. But I didn't flinch. I let her voice grasp at empty air. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was an accounting balance sheet, and they were completely overdrawn. Robert cut her off with a voice that was calm, factual, and completely lethal. He pulled out the secondary file, dropping the definitive criminal kill shot straight onto the porch table. He laid out the complete transaction history of the $24,000 I had handed over for her supposed oncology treatments. He revealed that we had already verified the explicit signature mismatch on the clinic authorization forms. More than that, when Robert threatened the centre with immediate exposure for complicity and identity theft, their own internal compliance team panicked and handed over the digital data trails directly from their administrative portal. They provided the exact time-stamped electronic logs proving Stephanie had used my liquidated mutual funds to fund a $23,000 lifestyle sculpting package under a completely manufactured medical identity. It wasn't just a family disagreement. It was grand larceny and corporate-level structured fraud, a felony carrying a statutory prison sentence of up to 5 years. Robert explained that the Cosmetic Centre had already flagged their fraudulent invoices to cooperate fully with the investigation, leaving Stephanie completely exposed to immediate arrest. He gave them an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. They had exactly 48 hours to vacate 516 Magnolia Lane. They were permitted to take their personal clothing and electronic devices, but anything else removed from the property would be prosecuted as immediate theft. The power had completely flipped in a matter of minutes. Matthew looked up at his wife, his face ghostly white as the first massive crack fractured their toxic alliance, realizing that underestimating a 68-year-old widow was the most expensive error of their entire lives. The illusion of solidarity shattered right before my eyes. Under the suffocating pressure of an immediate criminal indictment and sudden homelessness, their unified front dissolved into absolute pathetic betrayal. Stephanie didn't think about her husband's dignity for a single second. She spun around, pointing a manicured finger directly at Matthew's face, her voice shrieking like shattered glass. It was his idea, she screamed, her eyes wild with panic. He is the one who wanted that fancy 3-bedroom condo in Manhattan. He is the one who looked up the cheap care facilities outside the city. I only did what he told me to do. Matthew looked at his wife, completely stunned, the realization of her immediate betrayal hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't defend himself. Instead, my 43-year-old son collapsed heavily onto his knees right there on the wooden porch boards, weeping uncontrollably. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my robe, begging, "Mom, please, please don't do this. You will destroy my career. You will destroy my life." I was desperate, Mom. Stephanie pressured me into everything. I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet, tracking the ghost of the little boy I once cradled through pneumonia, but feeling absolutely nothing but freezing detachment. There was no anger left in me. No sadness, no panic, no lingering maternal guilt. It was clinical. Staring at his frantic, weeping face, I witnessed the raw execution of a universal psychological truth. This was the collapse of an empty, parasitic ego, the sudden burst of the illusion of power that comes with an unearned wallet. For 3 months, these two had walked through my home like conquerors, assuming that my age made me weak and that my assets were their personal birthright. They wore their arrogance like armor, thinking their lifestyle goals justified my systematic erasure. But their authority was a total simulation, a status they had rented using my stolen dignity and my liquidated emergency capital. The exact moment the pipeline of unearned wealth is permanently severed by the iron wall of the law, the narcissist grandiosity instantaneously evaporates. Strip away their access to the victim's money, and they do not stand tall. They drop to their knees, weeping and begging for the very mercy they refuse to grant. I pulled my robe back, ensuring his trembling fingers couldn't touch me, and pressed play on the mini recorder one final time. Matthew's own voice echoed across the quiet porch, flat and remorseless. "Mom has lived here long enough. We deserve this house." The recording cut through his current tears like a razor blade, removing any remaining path to redemption. Robert Gregory stepped forward, sliding a formal legal notice of no contact and unconditional exit across the table. Beside his heavy notary seal, "Sign it," Robert commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. Stephanie grabbed the pen with shaking hands, signing her name in frantic, jagged strokes, while Matthew dragged himself up to do the same, his face completely ghostly white. They signed without reading, desperate to avoid the immediate arrival of the police. I took the documents back, watching them look at me, not as a mother they could manipulate, but as a sovereign force they could never cross again. The moving truck vanished around the corner of Magnolia Lane at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening under a heavy, warm South Carolina dusk, leaving my home in a quiet I hadn't felt in months. I didn't sit in the dark, grey living room to mourn the absence of my son or the vacuum left by their departure. Instead, I walked straight into the kitchen, turned on the flame, and began brewing hot tea using the traditional porcelain cups Stephanie had hidden away. The dark grey paint on my walls remained a stark, temporary scar, but I already had the fresh cream and white paint swatches resting on the counter, waiting for the weekend renovation. The true inheritance my husband David left me wasn't the $850,000 in real estate equity. It was the unyielding internal sovereignty required to close the door on my own flesh and blood to preserve my absolute right to live with dignity. I've come to realize that what people often completely misunderstand about family dynamics is the toxic cultural lie that a mother's forgiveness must function as an infinite, boundaryless wasteland. The world expects aging parents to gracefully swallow psychological abuse, systemic financial theft, and literal erasure just to keep the peace. But the truth is, unconditional tolerance of disrespect isn't love. It is familial enabling. When you allow your children to turn your kindness into a weapon against your own survival, you aren't protecting the family bond. You are directly funding your own destruction. The unvarnished, uncomfortable reality of life is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and giving life to a child does not give them a license to dictate the expiration date of your autonomy. If you find yourself in a similar situation, caught in a home that feels like an emotional prison, watching people you love dismantle your peace piece by piece, remember this. Setting an iron barrier against predation isn't a betrayal of love. It is the ultimate reclamation of your soul. Real love never requires you to destroy your own house to keep someone else warm. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from their expectations and walk into your own strength. Have the courage to change the locks on your life, enforce your boundaries with absolute precision, and watch the parasites crumble under the weight of their own choices. 6 months later, Matthew and Stephanie were living out the consequences of their choices, facing a bitter, asset-stripping divorce and bankruptcy, while my grandchildren's future remained securely insulated inside the trust until they reached the age of 25 years old. I didn't feel joy or malice, only absolute peace. If this journey gave you the strength you needed to face your own boundaries today, please hit share, drop a comment below, and stay with me here so we can continue honouring the journeys of those who chose to stand up, live authentically, and reclaim their peace on their own terms.